The street names of modern Paris reflect some of the most eminent French mathematicians of the 18th and 19th centuries. In the cemetery of Père Lachaise, overlooking the city, one of the most influential, though little known, mathematicians is buried. Here, Gaspard Monge was laid to rest in 1818 by his former students from the École Polytechnique. As he was in political disgrace at the time of his death, his admirers risked persecution by erecting this monument to his work. In his time, Gaspard Monge was the foremost teacher of geometry in France. He was a founder of one of its greatest educational institutions, the École Polytechnique. The work of Monge and his colleagues laid the foundations both mathematically and institutionally for some of the greatest advances in 19th century mathematics. We start our story in the French Revolution. With the vanishing of royal power in France, new styles of government were established in the 1790s. Old economic and social institutions were abolished. A new spirit was abroad. Despite terror and chaos, scientists and mathematicians did what they could to lend their talents to the new republic. The revolution would lead to the end of the prestigious Royal Academy of Sciences, based in the Louvre, to be replaced by a new organization, the Institute of France. In those revolutionary years, everything seemed possible. A number of grand schemes for reform were proposed, including a scheme for reforming weights and measures so that they would be standard across the country, preferably internationally. A commission was set up, and to it were appointed the leading mathematicians of the country, Monge, Lagrange, Laplace, Legendre, all people we'll hear more of later. And here, in the library of the Institute of France, is preserved one of the most remarkable products of those revolutionary years, the great 19-volume set of trigonometrical and logarithmic tables to decimal divisions, set up by the Commission and carried out by an engineer, Gaspard de Prony. So here, for example, in this volume of sine tables, we can see how the right angle was divided into 10,000 parts. For example, 0.0303 of a right angle in the new division is what corresponded to 2 degrees, 43 minutes, 37.2 seconds in the ancient division. And its sine is 0.04757 and so on for 29 decimal places, an unprecedented degree of accuracy. So how were these results achieved? This mammoth task was carried out by the idea of division of labour, which de Prony got from the Scottish political economist Adam Smith. Smith's The Wealth of Nations contains a description of how a pin-making factory works, and de Prony applied this to the production of these tables. He set up 3 teams. The top team, headed by the mathematician Legendre as factory manager, so to speak, drew up the analytical formulae on which the rest were calculated. The second team, who were less highly trained, converted these formulae into numbers, which were then passed to the third team, who were virtually untrained people and only had to add and subtract according to instructions they were given, and enter the results in these tables. To check the calculations, de Prony had 2 sets of teams working on the tables. The set of tables produced by one team is here, The set produced by the other team is a couple of miles away at the Paris Observatory. On the first page of these sign tables, we have a note giving instructions for the printing of the tables. It says that when they are printed, the proofs have to be checked against both sets of tables. But when de Prony finally completed his tables, they were considered too expensive to print. But they remained here in the Institute of France, available for consultation. And the division of the right angle into decimal parts was passed into law in 1799, along with the other components of the decimal system. The reform of weights and measures was but one concern of the new revolutionary state. The whole of the educational system was undergoing a major reconstruction. Successive governments planned to set up a series of primary, secondary and higher schools for the people of France. But to implement this, a large number of trained teachers was required. It was to this building in the Botanical Gardens of Paris that trainee teachers were assembled in haste from every region of France. This amphitheatre was the lecture hall of what became known in 1795 as the École Normale. In this room, the standards, the norms for the French educational system were to be set. Mathematics was a very important part of the curriculum, and here the country's leading mathematicians came to lecture. Laplace and Lagrange came here to teach how to teach elementary mathematics. Laplace, the country's great applied mathematician. Lagrange, the great pure mathematician, who had been headhunted, as it were, from Berlin to come to Paris before the Revolution.
You have seen how the second, third, and fourth degree equations can be solved. The fifth degree presents a sort of barrier which the analyst's efforts have not yet broken through. And the general resolution of equations is one of the things in algebra which still remain to be cleared up.
Lagrange, the leading mathematician not only of France but of all Europe, was here lecturing to some 1,200 students, ranging from extreme youth to old age, and in ability from virtual innumeracy to the talents of the young Joseph Fourier, who was to become a distinguished mathematical physicist. Joseph Fourier, who was the ablest of all the École Normale's students, wrote an account of the time in which he described his experiences.
Lagrange has a strong Italian accent. Everyone knows that he's an extraordinary person, but one needs to have seen him to recognize him as a great one. Some of what he says excites ridicule. The other day he said, "There are a lot of important things to be said on this subject, but I shall not say them."
From the transcripts of the lectures, which are all copied down and printed, we can tell that the Granges must have been well above the head of most of his pupils. Gaspard Monge also taught here. He drew on his 30 years' experience of teaching military engineers and lectured on a subject he had virtually invented, called descriptive geometry.
The purpose of this art is to represent exactly, on drawings which have only 2 dimensions, objects which have 3. It's needed by the engineer who conceives of a plan, by those who must see that it's carried out, and finally by the workers who must execute the various parts. Not only is it suitable for training the intellectual faculties of a great people and for making a contribution to the perfecting of the human race, it is also indispensable for all those workmen whose aim is to give bodies certain definite forms.
But Monge's lectures too must have seemed very theoretical to those who were to go and teach children in the furthest reaches of France. The École Normale turned out to be a very expensive enterprise, however. And after 4 months, the school closed and the trainee teachers were all sent home. But those lectures had sown the seed for a new idea in French education, that of getting the greatest scientists and mathematicians to train the new generation. But even before the students of the École Normale were sent home, Gaspard Monge was planning a higher level school. The idea was to create a single national school for the training of civil and military engineers. In contrast to the École Normale, the planning for this new organization, which was to become the École Polytechnique, was meticulous. Someone who has been particularly concerned with the early history of the École Polytechnique is Professor Jean d'Ombre.
Education was in turmoil during the revolution in France, and many projects were being thought of. A lobby of scientists acted in order to create the École Polytechnique within the framework of the revolutionary government. Monge was an enthusiastic member of this group. He modeled the new school according to the patterns of the military schools where he had been a professor previously. But the new patterns were different in the sense that they were systematic. The school was located in Paris, so that it centralized all the able students from all over France. Among those professors, there was obviously Monge himself, the famous Lagrange, but also people like de Prony, Poisson, or Fourier. The first year, the recruitment was 400 students, but after the arrival of Napoleon I, this number stabilized around 120 students, coming really from all over France.
The role of Napoleon was a very important one. Mathematically trained himself, he had joined the Institute of France, the successor to the Royal Academy of Sciences, in the late 1790s. This is an attendance record of the Institute. Napoleon Bonaparte's signature is here, followed by those of Laplace, the chemist Berthollet, and Gaspard Monge. In 1798, Napoleon organized a vast expedition to Egypt. Monge was one of those who was taken along in part of the scientific entourage. When the expedition returned, their results were written up in a series of vast volumes. This is one of them. They are kept here at the library of the present-day École Polytechnique. These volumes are full of very beautiful engravings. There, for example, the pyramids at Memphis. And the pages are very heavy. Here, the Temple of Karnak is shown from above and from the side. This picture shows you what you could do if you had been trained in the use of Monge's descriptive geometry. Monge's techniques showed you how to describe a three-dimensional object by projecting it in two planes. Of course, the use of descriptive geometry for military applications could get far more complicated than this.
During his military adventures in Egypt, Napoleon had sights on greater things. He came back to France as soon as possible and took power just before 1800. In 1804, he was crowned emperor, and a year later, he transferred the École Polytechnique to a new building, a new location where we are now. He imposed on the École a military status. Napoleon viewed science as very useful for his government, and at the École it maintained an emphasis on mathematics. In fact, the important man behind the scene at the École was Laplace. Laplace had been a minister of Napoleon and had a prominent position in the state. Laplace and Monge shared a common view on the role the École should play for the whole French educative system in mathematics. The idea was that the curriculum in mathematics as the École Polytechnique gave the standards on which the whole curriculum from the primary school to the end should be organized. And a way of doing so was to use textbooks. Therefore, there was an imposition on all the professors at the École to write textbooks. Those textbooks were effectively written and used throughout France in order to have a better education in mathematics. And it proved very influential for the further developments of mathematics itself on the continent.
And here are some of the textbooks developed by the teachers at the École Polytechnique for the use of their students. The Descriptive Geometry of Gaspard Monge. This comprises the verbatim transcript of the lectures he gave at the École Normale and was used by students at the École Polytechnique. The Elements of Geometry by Legendre. This was the leading geometry textbook, and indeed it sold some 40,000 copies every year. It was the main textbook, indeed, for over a century in France and in America also. The leading calculus textbook was by Lacroix. He had succeeded Legendre at the École Polytechnique, and in this book he summarized the developments in calculus during the preceding centuries. It was a very clear and judicious textbook. So, through its textbooks and also through its organization, the École Polytechnique soon became the most prestigious center for teaching and learning in France, and abroad too. For example, in 1802, the United States Military Academy was set up at West Point and used the École Polytechnique as its model. But teaching and writing textbooks was not the only thing which the professors did. They also carried on with their researches. The Journal of the École Polytechnique, which was originally set up to carry transcripts of lectures, became a journal which also carried studies by the students themselves, as well as the reports of research by their teachers. This whole volume of the journal, for example, is devoted to some of Lagrange's work on the calculus of functions. And Laplace, final year examiner at the École, published his great work on celestial mechanics, which led him to be called the Newton of his age. This volume carried a glowing tribute to Napoleon Bonaparte, which Laplace prudently omitted in editions of this book issued after Napoleon's fall in 1815. So, what mathematical traditions emerged from these early years at the École Polytechnique? Let us look at one example in particular. Jean Poncelet was a student of Monge. He entered the École Polytechnique in 1807. 5 years later, found himself on the Russian front in Napoleon's offensive. He was taken prisoner, and it was in a Russian prison, therefore, in 1813, that Poncelet set about reconstructing the geometry he had learnt from Monge and developing it further into a new area called projective geometry. What Poncelet had done was to take the descriptive geometry of Monge, a subject akin to engineering drawing, which never developed very much beyond Monge's own ideas, and ally to it an older idea, that of studying what properties objects have in common with their shadows. These two developed into projective geometry, a subject of much deeper mathematical interest. An example of the kind of result that was developed was this. Suppose we have a conic section. In this case, a circle. Now take a point P outside it. Draw the tangents to the circle. And draw the chord joining the points of contact. It's the chord corresponding to P that we'll be interested in. What happens if we move P? We get a new chord for each new position of P. What's really interesting is when P moves along a curve. So, when P traces out this curve, its chords envelop another. This new curve is called the dual of the other. And interesting properties of one curve give rise to interesting properties of the other. For example, if the first curve has an inflection point, the point where the curve crosses its tangent, then the dual curve has a cusp. Geometers found duality an interesting feature of projective geometry, and by using it they discovered many interesting properties of curves. In such ways, the influence of Morge lived on through his students. Projective geometry, in fact, was developed more strongly in Germany than in France. The reason is possibly that French mathematicians took up more strongly calculus and analysis, other subjects fostered by teachers at the École Polytechnique. But in any case, political times had changed. With the final exile of Napoleon in 1815, his old friend and comrade Morge fell into political disfavour. He was now an old man, and he was even dismissed from the Institute of France. But when a couple of years later he died, here to his tomb came students and former students from the École Polytechnique to pay tribute to Morge and what he stood for they saw, more strongly than the authorities, what it was that Morge and his old comrades had achieved. They had laid a firm foundation for French mathematics in the 19th century, and perhaps we might say for the mathematics of all Europe.